World War II was not only a battlefield for armies, but also for laboratories. History during this period witnessed a rapid leap in technologies that were developed solely for the purpose of survival, superiority, and terror. This war caused the line between science and violence to become narrower than ever. Governments spent enormous resources guiding scientists towards discoveries that were often outside the bounds of morality. This article narrates some of these innovations that were sometimes born in complete silence. Some of them later became influential in the modern world, and some remained hidden only in dark history. Our narrative goes from the depths of the sea to radio waves and secret laboratories. Along the way, some of the innovations redefined the power of countries. Technologies that changed the face of the world even after the war ended. But in their time, they were only tools for killing. With fierce competition, empires sought to turn every second to their advantage. Every innovation could be the difference between survival and destruction. Military headquarters around the world began a secret race. The goal was not just military superiority, but the speed of technological implementation. Ideas that had taken years in peacetime were now being developed in months. This relentless pace gave rise to a new form of research. Research with one goal in mind: superiority on the battlefield. Behind every invention was a team of scientists, engineers, and strategists. Many of them worked in silence. Their work was secret, their results shrouded in darkness. But one day, those results would change the terrain and time of battle. World War II was not just a war of tanks and armies, but also a war of minds. During this period, physics, chemistry, biology, and electronics became weapons. Technology showed its most deadly face. Scientists were faced with a difficult question, a question between morality and necessity, a necessity that grew with each attack and each defeat, and morality that was gradually forgotten. The battlefield was the testing ground. The results were bloody, but the advances were stunning. From under the seas to the skies, innovation was surging. Every discovery was a new story, a story that amazed the world, and sometimes terrified it. In the meantime, some countries built large research centers with careful organization. From Europe to East Asia, huge laboratories were formed, all filled with scientists who were traveling a one-way path, a path of no return. Some technologies were never used, but some changed the boundaries of the battlefield. Innovations were sometimes secret, sometimes public, but always effective. To properly understand emerging weapons, one must understand the spirit of the times, a time that combined fear, power, and ruthlessness, a time when the number of victims exceeded the number of achievements. In this context, politics and science went hand in hand. Each country had its own narrative, a narrative full of victories and defeats, full of destruction and reconstruction. Weapons were not just tools. They reflected the strategic thinking of nations. At the heart of every technology lay a philosophy of war, a cold, callous, and calculating philosophy. The arms race changed the familiar boundaries of war. Power was transferred from muscle to brain, from the battlefield to the calculation rooms, and scientists became the new soldiers. Every plan was kept in the strictest secrecy. Plans were archived, encrypted. Information was carefully hidden. Every night, new ideas were proposed, and every day, new experiments were conducted. Some were successful, some failed, and some were never tested. But the goal was always the same: to create superiority. This superiority could take thousands of lives, or save them. This duality was the heart of World War II technology, the duality between innovation and destruction. Knowledge became a weapon, and weapons became the factor that judged nations. In this dark decade, humanity was able to push technological boundaries that were previously unimaginable. Germany, Britain, the United States, Japan, and the Soviet Union each shaped parts of this history. Innovations were made from cold waters to remote forests. Everywhere, science was a tool for commanders. Our narrative begins at a point when the world was still in shock at the outbreak of war, when everything was changing, and no one knew where the end of this path would be. As the years of war passed, many truths came to light. Some remained hidden. But what is certain is the lasting impact of these technologies on the future, a future that remained in their shadow even after the war ended. Because science, having tasted the power of war, never returned to its original state. Submarines became the mainstay of covert attacks at sea during World War II. Their main mission was to disrupt enemy naval supply lines. Germany, focusing on asymmetric warfare, greatly expanded its U-boat fleet. Hunter groups would lie in wait in the Atlantic Ocean to find British merchant convoys. Deep-sea warfare required accurate intelligence and a high level of experience. The harsh weather of the North Sea made the missions even more difficult. Each submarine received a detailed course map when it left port. This route was determined based on enemy activity, convoy patterns, and weather data. Staying on the likely path of enemy convoys required constant coordination with command. The new generation of submarines were designed to reduce propeller noise and reduce the likelihood of detection. The German 21 class was an example of the most advanced design concept of the time. The submarine was capable of traveling underwater for long periods without surfacing. Its larger size allowed for greater battery storage. This structure reduced surface charging time. On the battlefield, reducing the time spent on the surface meant an increased chance of survival. In the dark of night, submarines would surface to recharge their batteries and get fresh air. But enemy reconnaissance aircraft were on the lookout for them at all hours of the day and night. Moonlight increased the risk of detection by aircraft. As a result, commanders also factored astronomy into their calculations when choosing when to surface. Enemy sonar was the most important threat to submarines. The sound of the propeller was the smallest part of the submarine that could be detected. Therefore, stealth maneuvers had to be performed at the lowest engine speed. Long patrols were conducted under severe psychological stress. The crew lived in extremely cramped conditions. The smell of fuel, oil, and humidity permeated all quarters. The air gradually became unhealthy, and ventilation systems were limited. Food was stockpiled, its quality deteriorating over the weeks. On some missions, the crew would remain at sea for months without returning to port. Constant fatigue affected their concentration. Any contact with the enemy could destroy the ship. The commander had to make precise decisions in a matter of seconds. Firing a torpedo required calculating the angle, speed, and distance to the target. Any mistake could reveal the submarine's position. After firing, the submarine had to immediately move to greater depth, then continue on its escape route at very low speed. The torpedo's impact on the target could only be detected by sound. After that, the likelihood of an enemy counterattack was very high. Escort ships searched for submarines with radar and sonar. Depth charges were the most important means of countering submarines. These bombs were detonated at adjustable depths. Their explosion exerted great pressure on the submarine's hull. Sometimes this pressure caused cracks and water to enter. In some cases, the submarine escaped unharmed, but the sound of the impact and the intense vibration terrified the crew. Evading anti-submarine attacks required complete silence. All activities were stopped, with only essential systems left on. The crew even avoided talking to reduce acoustic vibration. At great depths, the water pressure was close to the limit of the metal hull's endurance. Every additional meter increased the risk of structural damage. If the hull was damaged, water leakage could upset the balance. The pumps had to be activated quickly and the water drained. Sometimes it was decided to let the submarine lie down on the seabed. This was dangerous in the rocky area, but if it was successful, the enemy's sonar would not receive a clear signal. In an emergency, the submarine would remain motionless for hours. This tactic was very useful for deceiving the enemy. After the enemy's search was over, the submarine would be slowly reactivated. Information was exchanged with the command via coded messages. The transmission time of the messages had to be short so that the enemy would not detect the direction of the signal. Radio detection of the submarine's position was one of the most important intelligence tools for the Allies. Therefore, communications were minimal and very fast. In waters with high seas traffic, there was also the threat of collision. At night, any surface ship could be a danger. The submarine used only periscopes to detect targets. The periscope's visibility was limited and it was difficult to identify the target. In bad weather, the possibility of error increased. A mistake could put the submarine on a collision course. In shallow areas such as the English Channel, there was no room for maneuver. These areas were known as death fields for submarines. Larger submarines preferred not to operate in these areas. In the Atlantic, the distances were very long. These distances required careful management of fuel and supplies. Attacks on convoys were carried out in groups. The Germans called this tactic wolf pack. In this method, several submarines operated in coordination. After detecting a convoy, the submarine sent information to other units. Then, the attack was launched from different directions. This tactic was very successful early in the war. However, with the development of radar and radio interception, its effectiveness declined. With the advent of long-range aircraft, the submarine safe zone became smaller. Cooperation between aircraft and escort ships took a heavy toll. By the end of the war, submarine losses were very high. Crews knew that their chances of recovery were slim. Nevertheless, operations continued. A new generation of submarines were designed, but they arrived late. The 21 class had the potential to change the rules of war, but their small numbers and short duration prevented them from having a major impact. Despite all the advances, submarines could not change the course of the war, but their experience and technology became the basis for later developments in the Cold War era.
Torpedoes became the mainstay of the offensive power of submarines and some surface ships in World War II. Their structure consisted of a metal hull, engine, control rudder, and explosive warhead. Most torpedoes were powered by a combustion or electric engine. Early models only traveled a straight path and had low accuracy. For this reason, the commander had to calculate the firing angle with great precision. The distance, target speed, wind direction, and water current were involved in the calculations. These calculations were made with special rulers and tables. A mistake in the angle meant a missed chance to attack. Each torpedo was a valuable reserve, and untimely use was dangerous. To fire, the submarine had to get close enough to the target. This proximity was very risky in shallow or choppy waters. The commander usually used the periscope to inspect the target. The periscope was raised briefly to avoid increasing the risk of detection. Once the position was determined, the firing command was given. At the moment of firing, a mechanical sound was muffled inside the ship. This sound could be detected by enemy sonar. Therefore, the shot was usually made before a quick escape. After firing, the submarine immediately sank. This was done to prevent detection. The torpedo moved within range of the target until it reached it. The crew could only follow the torpedo's movement by listening to the hydrophone. The sound of the torpedo hitting the target was a signal of success. In the event of a mistake, the commander decided to correct the position or leave the field. In some cases, the target changed course to escape the torpedo. Escort ships use zigzag movements to reduce the chance of collision. This tactic was called evasive maneuvering. As the war progressed, sound-guided torpedoes were introduced. These torpedoes adjusted their course based on the sound of the target's engine. This technology increased the likelihood of success. But countermeasures also developed. Ships carried devices that emitted sound waves to deflect the torpedo. These waves produced a sound similar to that of a ship's engine. The torpedo would be deflected towards the artificial sound and stay away from the original target. In real operations, water conditions played a significant role. Strong waves and currents would slightly alter the torpedo's course. As a result, firing in stormy seas was inaccurate. For this reason, many commanders preferred to attack in calm waters. Electric torpedoes were quieter than internal combustion engines. This silence made them less likely to be detected. However, their lower speed was a drawback. Faster torpedoes were useful for attacking fast-moving ships. The torpedo's explosive warhead usually contained a high-energy material such as TNT. The explosion below the surface of the water created a huge shock. This shock could dislodge the ship's hull. In some cases, the explosion would break the ship's backbone. This phenomenon led to the ship sinking rapidly. Some torpedoes were set to explode under the ship's keel. The explosion there maximized the destructive force. During the war, many successful submarine attacks were carried out using this method, including in the Atlantic Ocean, where merchant convoys were targeted. Sinking merchant ships put a heavy strain on the enemy's economy. Cutting off the supply lines of fuel, food, and ammunition could turn the tide of the war. For this reason, military escorts were very important. The escort ships were equipped with sonar and depth charges. Sonar was used to detect the submarine's position and the possibility of a counterattack. After firing a torpedo, the submarine had to immediately change course. This change of course was necessary to hide and avoid detection. In some cases, several torpedoes were fired in quick succession. This increased the chance of a collision. However, excessive use of torpedoes depleted the reserve and caused concern. Torpedoes were expensive and limited weapon. Therefore, their use had to be rational and targeted. Submarines were equipped with a limited number of torpedoes. This limitation had a direct impact on tactics. The commander usually tried to inflict maximum damage in each attack. If the target was a convoy, priority was given to ships carrying oil or ammunition. These ships were more vulnerable and valuable. Their explosion could also damage nearby ships. In some attacks, the submarines sank several ships alone. These successes had both propaganda and operational value for the command. Conversely, if the torpedo missed, the time for a second attack was limited because the escort ships reacted quickly. In shallow areas, the use of torpedoes was more dangerous because the submarine did not have enough space to escape. As a result, commanders avoided attacking in these areas. As the war progressed, new torpedoes were designed with advanced control systems. These models could correct the course according to the movement of the target. Some models used a guidance wire. This wire established a direct connection between the torpedo and the submarine. The commander used the transmitted information to adjust the course. This technology was introduced late in the war but was not widely used. The Allied forces also upgraded their torpedoes. In the Pacific, the United States used advanced torpedoes to attack Japanese carriers. In many battles, torpedoes played a decisive role, including in night battles when visibility was poor. In these conditions, torpedoes provided a great advantage for submarines and small ships. Over time, torpedoes became faster, more accurate, and more stealthy. By the end of the war, extensive experience had been gained in their design. This experience became the basis for the development of modern torpedoes. Today's torpedoes are a direct legacy of the efforts of that period.
Electronic warfare in World War II meant the control, interception, and disruption of enemy radio and electromagnetic information. Radio information quickly became a vital factor in command and decision-making. Commanders knew that any radio message could reveal the location of troops. Radios were widely used to coordinate ships, aircraft, and armored vehicles. As the volume of communications increased, electronic interception networks were formed. Interception units were installed behind the front and on ships to record enemy signals. These units sent the information to analysis centers so that patterns could be identified. It became possible to find the direction of a transmitter with radio direction finders. The HFDF system, known as HFDF, was able to determine the approximate direction of a transmitter. The coordinates of the transmitter could be calculated from the intersection of the directions. This method was very effective in identifying the position of submarines at the time of sending a message. Previously, submarines would expose themselves to danger when sending a message. With HFDF, detection and tracking became faster and less expensive. Listening centers, called WWII stations, collected the signals. These centers were located at different geographical distances and analyzed the signals simultaneously. The collected information was sent to decoding units. Decoding messages, especially the breaking of Enigma, played a central role in operational intelligence. Failure to maintain the secrecy of transmitters could jeopardize the entire operation. Radio transmitters had different power and range, which made it possible to determine the type of operation. Long range was used for communication between command centers and rear lines. Short range was used for tactical communications close to the front. Frequencies varied depending on weather conditions and time of day. Finding the best frequency for safe transmission was part of the radio operator's job. The transmitter's output power had to be balanced against operational needs and the risk of detection. The higher the power, the greater the range, and the greater the probability of detection. Electronic warfare included both active and passive measures. Eavesdropping and navigation were passive measures. Jamming and the generation of false signals were active measures. Fighter aircraft and escort vessels were equipped with jamming transmitters to disrupt enemy communications. Sending strong signals could make enemy messages unreadable. This was used in large operations to disrupt enemy coordination. Radio jamming required high power and suitable antennas. Ground stations and shipborne transmitters were used in this role. The production of fake messages was also an effective technique for deceiving the enemy. Sending fake messages could force the enemy to adopt wrong tactics. In addition to jamming and forgery, signal concealment techniques were also developed. The use of complex codes and encryption was the main method of concealment. The Enigma machine was an example of a mechanical electronic encryption used by the German army. The Enigma machine used a combination of gears and wiring to encode messages in a variable way. Breaking this code by the Allies made it possible to access tactical information. But to maintain this success, the decryption operation had to be kept secret. The Allies used the decrypted information carefully to plan campaigns. Non-disclosure of the source of the information was essential to prevent the enemy from modifying their behavior. This is why operations often appeared to be conducted with other sources. Ground-based electronic warfare also involved detecting and disrupting enemy radio frequencies. On the battlefield, small jamming devices were used to disrupt operational communications. Tactical communications that could be intercepted were more vulnerable due to the simplicity of the codes. Experienced operators could extract useful information even with weak codes. Control of the frequency spectrum was considered an important resource on the battlefield. The battle for dominance of frequency bands was tangible in some operations.
Radar played a vital role as an electromagnetic detection tool. Early radars provided the ability to detect air and surface targets. Radar enabled reconnaissance aircraft and bombers to be tracked. Concealment from radar became a necessity. The use of absorption panels or aerodynamic deformations was considered in some designs. But simpler tactics also emerged, including the deployment of aluminum cotton or window to create a wide radar reflection. This artificial radar cover could deflect radar signals and distort the target's position. Both the Allies and the Axis used these techniques experimentally. In face of radar, the development of ECCM or countermeasures techniques also began. These included frequency shifting, signal filtering, and noise separation algorithms. Signal analysis capabilities were enhanced to distinguish between real targets and decoys. Mobile radio stations were installed for field operations to allow for rapid response. In amphibious operations, coordination between coastal radars and naval units was important. Radar information was sent in real time to guide air defenses. These coordinations required secure and stable communication lines. Without secure communication, radar produced only raw data that could be misinterpreted. Signal and communications units played a supporting role in operations. Radio operators were responsible for detection, tracking, and warning. Misinterpretation of radar data could result in friendly fire or missed opportunities for attack. Naval electronic warfare also included radar detection of shores and ship interception. Radar-equipped escort ships were unable to detect subsurface targets, but they did enable surface tracking. Increasing signal processing power at command centers allowed information from multiple sources to be combined. This data integration provided a more complete picture of the battlefield. Combining oral, radar, and visual sources reduced decision-making errors. At the tactical level, electronic warfare teams operated alongside combat units. They were responsible for disrupting enemy communications and providing cover for friendly units. Sabotage operations against enemy transmitting stations were also conducted as part of electronic warfare. Penetrating communications networks and destroying antennas or transformers had a direct impact on enemy coordination. The ability to disrupt air communications was especially important in bombing operations. By neutralizing enemy coordination, airstrikes were possible with fewer casualties. Electronic warfare also involved protecting friendly communications infrastructure. Sensitive radio stations required protection and camouflage. The use of dynamic codes and rapid frequency switching were among the protective methods. On the other hand, the presence of enemy listening stations was also a constant threat. Maintaining radio silence was a security requirement in some operations. Radio silence meant that communication was made only when necessary. This method was used to prevent navigation and position detection. However, radio silence made coordination difficult. Commanders had to balance security with the need for information. Electronic warfare led to the specialization of military units. Engineer units, signal analysts, and radio operators emerged as separate branches. Training and practice in the correct use of equipment were vital. Operator errors could lead to the situation being revealed or the operation being aborted. In some cases, the enemy used intercepted information to set up ambushes. Such ambushes were executed based on the timing of messages and navigation. The commander, who knew the approximate coordinates of the transmitter, could provide adequate cover. In naval operations, the combination of radio interception and visual reconnaissance yielded impressive results. Accurate radio interception sometimes surpassed visual reconnaissance. Because the enemy could leak information via radio, even while maintaining physical concealment. The pandemic of radio messages gradually revealed the enemy's movement plan. For this reason, information security and radio resource management became increasingly important. As technology advanced, electronic warfare became one of the determining factors for the success of operations. By the end of the war, many lessons had been learned about the use and defense against electronic means. These experiences formed the foundations of modern electronic warfare and future information systems.
Radar was still maturing as a vital reconnaissance tool in the early years of World War II. The ability to detect targets at long distances transformed the nature of air and naval combat. In Europe, the threat of long-range bombers made clear the need for an early warning system. The British coast was equipped with a network of early radars that formed the warning chain.
This network became known as Chain Home and was able to prevent surprise attacks. The system's large antennas were able to detect enemy aircraft at long distances. This early detection provided sufficient time for fighters to prepare. With the help of this system, British skies were able to withstand intense attacks by the Luftwaffe. Radar systems initially had low accuracy and limited resolution, but this raw information was also of great operational value. Radar data was transmitted to the command room via communication networks. There, analysts reviewed the information and predicted possible attack routes. The results of these analyses led to the assignment of fighters to the appropriate area. This reduced reaction time and increased efficiency. In the absence of radar, only lookouts were responsible for issuing warnings. Lookouts were unable to provide wide coverage due to limited visibility. Radar was able to compensate for this weakness and determine the enemy's operational distance during the approach phase. In contrast, attackers sought ways to reduce the effectiveness of radar. Flying at low altitudes was a common method of concealment. At this altitude, radar waves interfered with the ground, making detection more difficult. However, this method consumed more fuel and increased the risk of hitting obstacles. On the other hand, fast, medium-altitude aircraft quickly entered the visual range. This situation increased the pressure on the analysis units. At sea, warships were also equipped with radar systems. These ships were able to detect surface and air targets at long distances. Radar information played an important role in convoy escort operations. Submarines could only be detected near the surface. Therefore, radar, combined with searchlights, increased the chance of detecting a target at night. However, submarines tried to avoid radar detection by appearing briefly and stealthily. Weather conditions also affected radar performance. Humidity, precipitation, and heavy fog reduced the signal-to-noise ratio. Operators had to distinguish data from chaotic signals. Errors in data recording could lead to erroneous responses. In some cases, heavy clouds and atmospheric disturbances produced false signals. Detecting these false signals was part of the operator's skill. On the ground battlefield, radar was used more sparingly. Early ground applications included detecting enemy artillery and tracking mortars. This gave more accurate counterfire. Radar-based air operations expanded. Bombers were able to find targets at night using radar navigation systems. The advent of navigation radar led to an increase in night missions. These systems determined the flight path in limited visibility conditions. At this stage, accuracy was poor but seemed adequate for wide-ranging missions. Ground units used special camouflage to counter enemy radar. The use of opaque paints and large covers to break radar reflections became common. Along with physical camouflage, radar camouflage was also considered. The scattering of aluminum foil or window was used to deflect radar waves. The foil created numerous unanalyzable reflections. As a result, radar operators were unable to detect the real target. This method was a significant success in large-scale air operations. Intelligence agencies were tasked with collecting data on the performance of enemy radar. This information was vital for the development of new versions of radar. In factories, engineers sought to increase the accuracy and range of radars. Increasing the wavelength and changing the frequency were two effective ways to improve performance. Adequate resolution required more processing power at the stations. At the time, analog processing equipment was limited. Operators had to play a major role in interpreting and classifying the data. Training the operators to see was of great importance. Experienced operators were able to extract meaningful patterns from the noise and clutter. They were of particular operational value during large-scale attacks. Radar also played an important role in coastal defense. On the coast, radar units were able to identify enemy ships and determine their course. This information was of great importance to coastal artillery units. Artillery fire guidance became more accurate with the help of radar information. At night, radar was the only effective means of tracking ships. Without radar, navigation in the dark was largely based on guesswork and preliminary data. But radar enabled decisive decision-making by showing the relative positions of targets. In the Pacific War, radar played an even more decisive role.
night naval battles between the US and Japanese fleets became heavily dependent on radar. The US fleet, with its more advanced radar systems, was able to gain a tactical advantage. At the Battle of Guadalcanal, radar allowed American forces to identify targets at night. The Japanese, who used weaker or no radar, were deprived of the advantage of visibility in the dark. This difference allowed the US to seize the lead in night battles. With the development of radar, night-flying fighter aircraft also emerged. These aircraft used a radar mounted on the nose to detect and track targets. This ability led to the flourishing of night air defense operations. Germany also developed ground and air radar to counter night bomber attacks. Cooperation between ground-based radars and interceptor aircraft led to a more effective defense network. However, extensive bombing still caused significant damage. One of the early problems with radar was its vulnerability to jamming. Sending strong signals on the same frequency could cripple the system. This method was used by some forces to prevent early warning. However, by changing the frequency and using new filters, the radar's robustness increased. The advent of microwaves brought about a major revolution in new radars. These waves allowed for greater accuracy and smaller antenna dimensions. Microwave radars were quickly installed in ships and aircraft. This miniaturization allowed more tactical units to use radar. These systems made it possible for the first time to detect small surface targets. Radar remained effective in foggy and rainy conditions. This was a valuable feature in Europe's changing climate. In winter, visibility was severely limited and radar was the only means of detection. The same capability proved effective on the Eastern Front. By the end of the war, radar was a pillar of military technology. The lessons learned from radar in the war shaped the development of electronic warfare and air defense systems in the 20th century.
Chemical and biological weapons were considered a potential threat during World War II, and sometimes as a research and development tool. Programs related to these types of weapons were pursued in secret in some countries and in separate research centers. These programs included research on pathogens, chemical toxins, and methods of protection and detection. Several projects focused on controlled experiments on animals and sometimes horrific experiments on humans. The findings of these experiments were often kept secret, and complete documentation was covered up or destroyed after the war. The practical battlefield use of biological weapons presented many practical and logistical challenges. Biological agents were affected by environmental conditions such as temperature, humidity, and sunlight, which varied their effectiveness. Transportation and storage of these agents required a cooling chain and special conditions that were rarely guaranteed on the battlefield. The stability of some agents in the environment could vary from hours to days, and this instability complicated the planning of use. On the battlefield, there was the possibility of unexpected exposure of friendly forces or civilians to the agent, which increased the risk of operations. This risk made military commanders cautious in making decisions to employ these weapons. A fundamental concern in field use was to control the range of spread and prevent widespread environmental contamination. In many cases, the use of biological weapons could have unpredictable long-term human and environmental consequences. As a result, some countries pursued research into these types of weapons as part of their deterrent capabilities, rather than as purely operational tools. Related research included the development of rapid detection methods, secure storage, and protective measures for their own forces. The development of masks, protective clothing, and quarantine protocols was part of the defensive measures. However, providing technical details about specific protections or disinfections would be outside the realm of historical and potentially exploitable technical information, and is therefore limited here to the macro level. Secret research units such as Unit 731 in Japan have been documented as being involved in cruel human experimentation and the development of pathogenic agents. In many cases, such programs involved illegal clinical trials and gross human rights violations. Government policies and military command sometimes protected these projects for intelligence purposes and military exploitation. Keeping these programs secret made evidence and documentation after the war complex and incomplete. Research into chemical agents also continued in some countries,
although widespread use in the field was not observed. Short and long-acting agents were tactically different, and the choice between them depended on the objective and the environmental conditions. The use of caustic or asphyxiating gases in World War I had provided a painful but educational experience for the next generation. For this reason, some commanders avoided repeating the gas experiments of World War I on a large scale. The preparation and concealment of shipments containing chemical and biological agents in wartime was difficult and sporadic. Transportation of these cargoes carried the risk of accidental contamination of troops and logistical facilities. They were therefore usually deployed and maintained in isolated, specially protected sites. Field tests to assess the effects of agents were usually conducted in controlled areas far from the population. But some projects left a disastrous record of misuse and civilian casualties. In the wartime information environment, rumors and news about the possible use of these weapons could cause public panic. This panic sometimes helped to weaken the civilian and military morale of the enemy, even without the actual use of the agent. The potential biological threat alone could therefore play a psychological role in the operation. But this psychological threat also had costs for the declaring society, as it increased public surveillance and caution. Medical responses to suspected cases typically involved isolating patients and attempting to control the spread. In the field hospital setting, quarantine and stratification of patients were the basic rules of outbreak management. Field doctors faced shortages of drugs, equipment, and specialized knowledge of new agents. These limitations reduced the effectiveness of the crisis response and increased mortality. Training medical personnel and manpower in the recognition and measurement of symptoms became part of defensive preparedness. In many cases, however, early signs of infection or poisoning were mistaken for common illnesses. These mistakes led to the unintentional spread of the outbreak and delays in control measures. Intelligence and health forces attempted to establish networks for rapid reporting of suspected cases. These networks were weak or disrupted on some fronts and had limited effectiveness. In field conditions, accurate identification of the agent was often impossible, and treatment was based on supportive symptoms. This supportive approach was not necessarily effective and required specialized treatments. One major problem was the long-term impact of environmental contamination, which could keep water and soil supplies contaminated for long periods. Cleaning up such contamination during or immediately after a war was extremely difficult and time-consuming. The agricultural and economic consequences of biological contamination could lead to poverty and famine in the affected areas. These consequences went beyond direct military objectives and complicated post-war reconstruction. In anti-biological operations, protective measures included the creation of physical barriers and restrictions on access to contaminated areas. Engineering forces played a role in establishing traffic regulations and controlling access. Informing the local population to reduce contact with suspected sources was also part of the response plan. However, in wartime, effective implementation of such measures often conflicted with resource constraints and military priorities. International reporting and interstate cooperation to combat biological threats was limited and sporadic during the period. After the war, limited investigations and trials uncovered some cases, but many documents were destroyed or confiscated. Parts of the military research continued as covert projects, or its conclusions were used in post-war cooperation. This situation caused legal and ethical issues related to biological and chemical research to remain for years. For field commanders, decisions about the possible use of these weapons were fraught with uncertainty and political risks. The cost-benefit calculation of biological use was very complex due to the unpredictable effects. In many cases, military commanders preferred to use weapons with greater control and more predictable consequences. From a logistical perspective, the safe and secure storage of biological agents required specialized facilities that were not available in wartime. As a result, practical applications of these weapons on a large scale remained limited. However, research and sampling efforts provided a foundation for subsequent knowledge that was debated and discussed in the post-war period. The issue of transferring information and evidence after the war was also complex,
with some countries keeping documents secret to protect strategic information. This prevented the development of a unified and globally documented narrative about the nature and scope of the programs. In the field, friendly forces exposed to contamination sometimes required immediate transport to better medical facilities. The emergency evacuation and transfer of patients under wartime conditions was fraught with transportation constraints and enemy threats. These constraints severely affected the timing of medical interventions. Logistical support for the provision of protective equipment, drugs, and disinfectants was always a challenge. The provision of these items was contested in wartime prioritization, and public health was sometimes considered a secondary priority. Field research frequently encountered serious ethical issues that were still being reviewed after the war. These issues included confidentiality, informed consent, and the use of data collected. Research programs that were obtained through unethical means were raised as legal and ethical issues after the war. Countries involved in the programs sometimes reacted inappropriately or belatedly in dealing with survivors and documents. From a military perspective, one of the reasons for the limited practical use of these weapons was the difficulty of controlling the range of effects and preventing feedback to friendly forces. Maintaining a safe space for friendly forces required sophisticated equipment and measures that were not perfect in combat conditions. In addition, the fear of retaliation and the intensification of a biological arms race between the parties was a significant deterrent. As a result, many commanders were unwilling to risk widespread use. Despite this prohibition and caution, research programs continued, and their scientific results were recorded or hidden in various forms. After the war, some of this knowledge was released in documents and research, while others remained hidden for security and political reasons. Issues arising from this period influenced subsequent international policies to limit biological and chemical weapons. Subsequent treaties and frameworks of international law were partly rooted in the experiences and concerns that emerged during this period. But a full and accurate account of all that was done remains in some parts obscure and to some extent inaccessible. In the end, what happened in the field demonstrated the complexity, risk, and far-reaching consequences associated with biochemical and biological weapons in wartime.
The V-1 and V-2 rockets were examples of the development of long-range, unguided, and guided weapons in World War II. These weapons were the first attempts to use rockets for strategic attack on cities. The V-1 was often referred to as an automatic bomber or flying bomb. The V-2 was the world's first operational ballistic missile to reach suborbital orbit. Both weapons were developed by Nazi Germany towards the end of the war. Their practical use was planned to suppress urban populations and disrupt enemy industry. From an operational perspective, each had its own unique requirements for production, maintenance, and launch. Engineer divisions were responsible for establishing launch sites in remote and camouflaged areas. Launch sites had to be selected to provide sufficient range to reach targets in Britain. The construction and maintenance of these sites required a large workforce and complex logistics. The V-1 had a free pilot jet engine that was set to travel a certain distance. The V-1 followed a straight path and a constant altitude, and had no complex guidance. This made it more accurate, but more predictable than air attacks. The V-2, however, was launched from the ground with a rocket engine and a ballistic trajectory, reaching its target in a rapid arc. The speed of the V-2 was very high and could not be detected by air defenses before it was intercepted. However, tracking and discovering the launch path before the missile arrived could have led to a counterattack and the destruction of the site. The logistics equipment for fueling and preparing the missiles had dangerous mechanisms, exposing workers to risk. The storage of rocket fuel and oxidant in wartime conditions required secure warehouses and heavy protection. Launches were usually planned at night or during cloud cover to make aerial detection difficult. Camouflage sites were achieved with visual deception and seismic concealment. Engineering teams had to work quickly and under dangerous conditions to install the launch tracks and structures.
Each launch required meticulous inspection of components, fuel, and control systems. In some cases, failed launches were due to technical or installation errors. A failed launch could result in fires and major explosions. These accidents caused casualties and revealed the location of the site. To reduce detection, sites were built in forests, hills, or in underground tunnels. Rail and road networks were important for moving missiles and large components. Local staff and the use of forced labor in some areas ensured supplies. The speed of production and the precision of the missile components were under severe time pressure. Laboratories and production plants were located inland, far from the bombing range. To protect information, the projects were kept under strict secrecy. However, losses from Allied air raids disrupted the plans. The V-1 launchers required a launch track and a simple control system. Once the V-1 left the track, it was propelled by a small jet engine. The sound of the V-1's engine provided an audible warning to people in its path. This monotonous, annoying sound served as a signal that a threat was imminent. In contrast, the V-2 was almost silent and sudden, eliminating reaction time. The V-2 rockets were technically more complex and more expensive than the V-1. The V-2's range, speed, and explosive effect made it a strategic threat. The V-1 was often countered by anti-aircraft guns, interceptor aircraft, and radar networks. V-1 interception required coordination between coastal radars and fighter squadrons. In some cases, pilots would swerve the V-1, causing it to crash into uninhabited areas. Although risky, this tactic was effective in reducing civilian casualties. There were few options for countering the V-2, as its trajectory was semi-predictable but very fast. Efforts were largely focused on discovering and destroying launch sites before they could be used. Signs of site activity included the identification of production advertisements, the movement of parts, and the deployment of supplies. Air reconnaissance and human intelligence units were used to detect this evidence. Allied air operations to capture factories and launch sites were given high priority. Precision bombing of transportation infrastructure also reduced the enemy's ability to move missiles. Resupply of critical missile supplies and parts was at risk of being lost en route or intercepted. Storing missiles in the open exposed them to the elements and moisture, causing damage. Some sites were repaired or relocated quickly after an attack. Launches were scheduled for specific seasons and weather conditions. Strong winds and rain could affect the V-1's range and relative accuracy. Extremely low or high temperatures affected the performance of the fuel and hydraulic systems. Starting and adjusting the V-2's engine required trained personnel and specialized equipment. The V-2 rocket engine used liquid fuel and oxidizer, which were difficult to store and manage. Leaks of fuel or reactive compounds could pose an explosion or poisoning hazard. Medical support teams were stationed near the sites to deal with potential accidents. Transportation logistics included cranes, wagons, and considerable mechanical power. Each launch had a set of technical checklists that had to be followed. Monitoring and recording launch data was important for error analysis and performance improvement. However, wartime conditions and time pressure sometimes made it difficult to accurately perform these procedures. The mortality rate among workers and operators in the event of an accident was high. The availability of skilled manpower was a major limitation on the continued operation of launches. The use of prisoner or forced labor in some areas reduced quality and increased risk. Concealing and camouflage around the site included the creation of natural decoys and camouflage structures. The presence of soot, fake chimneys, and artificial vegetation were common methods. Radio signals associated with the launch were activated for a short time to reduce the time it took to reveal the location. Ignoring protocols in times of emergency sometimes led to the disclosure of information. The rate of launch error depended on factors such as the quality of construction, preparation, and environmental conditions. The V-2 rockets were able to penetrate defenses because their trajectory was ballistic. Therefore, cities were more vulnerable to them, and the defensive response was less effective. Damage from rocket explosions was often concentrated and severe. Industrial infrastructure and transportation lines were the main targets in many attacks. The psychological pressure on the urban population was increased by the sudden and unwarranted attacks. Urban crisis management included the creation of shelters and the distribution of first aid. But even shelters were not always able to provide complete protection against the force of the blast. Allied intelligence analysis of resources and their production lines gradually became more complete. As this information grew, targeted operations were launched to eliminate missile capabilities. Some launch sites were disabled by bombing or lack of parts. But production and repair capacity was quickly restored in some areas. Missile production capacity became a measure of strategic power. The V-1 entered the field in greater numbers due to its cheaper and simpler mass production. The V-2 was less capable of mass production due to its complexity and cost. Both types of weapons required enormous human and material resources. Clandestine logistics to support these programs took up a large portion of military resources. Local intelligence gathering and cooperation with intelligence networks were used to locate the sites. Local communities in some areas were aware of the existence of these facilities or were forced to cooperate. Site discovery was often done through aerial photography and analysis of supply lines. Aerial photography could show construction activities by comparing before and after. Photo analysts could identify tracks, warehouses, and the footprints of heavy machinery. Once identified, precise targeting and pinpoint bombing were used to disrupt. In some cases, the destruction of a section of the supply chain was sufficient to temporarily halt production. But recovery and replacement of components were carried out quickly if possible. The human and material costs of the rocket program for the German side were criticized in comparison to the operational efficiency. Post-war analysis showed that many resources were spent on projects that had limited strategic returns. However, operational experience accelerated the development of rocket technology in the post-war period. Launch technologies, rocket engines, and launch logistics management remained as a military legacy. A review of the operational conditions of the V-1 and V-2 shows that the production, deployment, and counteraction of such weapons required a vast network of resources, information, and engineering capabilities.
Sonar was the basis for searching and tracking submarines during World War II. Early sonar technology, known as ASDIC, was used to send out pulses of sound and receive the echoes. The sonar operator would send out the pulses and then wait for the echoes to return. The echoes bounced off the submarine's hull or underwater components, giving an approximate distance. It took a lot of experience for the operators to distinguish the type of echoes and distinguish them from the noise of the sea. The seabed was full of false echoes, originating from the seabed, algae blooms, or warm water masses. Thermal layers of water could bend the sound path and reduce the effective range of the sonar. In some situations, a submarine could hide in the thermal layer and escape detection by the sonar. Surface waves and wind also produced ambient noise and reduced sensitivity. The speed of the ship carrying the sonar had to be balanced so that the reflections could be interpreted. Fast movement created noise in the flow around the hull and reduced reception efficiency. To increase the probability of detection, the ships would patrol in specific patterns. Sending repeated pulses required managing the power of the sonar station to avoid damaging the sensors. The time between the pulse and the reflection had to be recorded in the equipment to calculate the distance to the elements. Determining the angle of the reflection was key to estimating the direction of the target. However, accurate angle determination with the sonars of the time had its limitations. At long distances, the signal became very weak and target separation became difficult. With training, operators could distinguish between ship and submarine reflections. Experience in hearing sound patterns and reflections from different elements was essential. Sonar was used extensively in convoy protection operations. Escorts formed a defensive line by positioning themselves at specific positions between the convoy and the threat. Escort units would approach whenever sonar detected a valid contact. Escort ships had offensive and defensive positions and made a split-second decision to attack. Depth charges were placed based on an estimate of the target's depth. A mistake in estimating depth could severely reduce the effectiveness of the attack. Depth charges were detonated upon reaching the set depth to create a destructive pressure wave. The underwater pressure wave had the ability to damage the submarine's hull and sometimes cause water to enter. Depth bombing was carried out in concert by several escort ships. Radio coordination between units was vital at these times. ASP patrols often operated in groups to increase the likelihood of success. Attack tactics included rapid attack, dispersion of course, and return to patrol. The development of new weapons such as the Hedgehog changed the methods of countermeasures. The Hedgehog was a launchable missile that exploded on impact. The Hedgehog differed from depth charges in the type of fuse and the need for a direct hit. This feature allowed a wave of frontal attacks to be launched without losing sonar contact. In training, operators and commanders practiced the combination of sonar and weapons. Support aircraft played a complementary role in anti-submarine warfare. Aircraft could detect surface submarines by radar and visual sighting. Equipment like the Lee light allowed aircraft to illuminate and detect submarines at night. Carrier escort aircraft increased the number of surface searches. The use of air-sea networks made the hunt more effective. Aircraft also carried depth charges and rockets to attack submarines. The combined effect of simultaneous surface and air attacks increased the chances of destruction. Using aircraft to scout and then ships to pursue became a common tactic. Other sources of information, such as HFDF, helped to narrow the search area. The combination of oral, sonar, and radar information gave a nearly complete picture of the enemy's position. But errors and interference were always present, leading to false contacts. False contacts could waste resources and fatigue units. Ship and aircraft crews were under the constant psychological strain of anti-submarine operations. Maintaining sonar equipment in sea conditions required regular maintenance and the skill of engineers. Damage to the sonar hull or water ingress could reduce detection for days. Operations in cold, icy waters made repair conditions more complicated. Sonar manufacturers sought to increase range and accuracy to detect smaller targets. Improved signal processing systems helped to separate noise from the target. Problems caused by reflections from the seabed in shallow areas were a constant challenge. Care was taken to protect the propellers and reduce the sound of ships to reduce background noise. Propeller noise and cavitation could make it difficult to detect the position of an anti-submarine unit. Submarines employed tactics to reduce their sonar output. Relative engine silence and reduced propeller speed were among these methods. But in some situations, the need for speed gave away the location. Sonar operators spent long hours listening to the reflections. Accurately identifying strange sounds and determining their origin was an art for an experienced operator. Specialized schools were established to train sonar operators. Actual exercises in simulated waters provided practical experience. Contact analysis was performed to determine the target's speed and direction. Target motion patterns and possible maneuvers had to be factored into the calculations. This process was known as Target Motion Analysis, or TMA. TMA was essential for determining the target's predicted position before firing. An error in estimation in TMA could render an attack ineffective. Escort ships often executed sudden turns to deflect enemy sonar. To maintain contact, one of the units was usually kept close to the position. In low visibility conditions, sonar was the only reliable sense for detecting submarines. Some submarines attempted to mislead by producing artificial sounds. This noise production could deceive the operator or confuse the sonar. The Allies gradually developed means of acoustic countermeasures and decoys. Acoustic decoys and generated waves were used to distract torpedoes and sonar. The use of shipboard acoustic devices or Foxers as decoys became common. These devices deflected acoustic torpedoes by producing a loud noise. However, the use of these devices themselves increased the noise of the field. Coordination between ships during an attack was essential to avoid friendly fire. In some operations, ships were forced to sacrifice position to protect the convoy. Heavy warships did not usually operate in the direct escort role, but were in the rear support. Frigates and corvettes were used as light and agile anti-submarine units. Their smaller size allowed them to maneuver better in pursuit. Each anti-submarine unit carried its own communications and tracking equipment. Shore stations also helped to detect and guide the units. In long-duration operations, changing ships was important for crew rest. Fatigue from operators could lead to the loss of vital communications. Night operations put additional strain on the operators and increased errors. Maintaining a low sound level inside the ship was part of the regulations to help operators concentrate. The bandwidth of the sonar was limited and proper selection of settings was important. War experience led to standardization of some procedures and patrol cycles. After each success or failure, detailed analysis was conducted to improve tactics. Gradually, technologies such as MAD and magnetic surveys by aircraft came into play. These sensors were capable of detecting the metal of the submarine's hull near the surface. But MAD was short-range and was usually used in conjunction with radar and visual searches. The formation of carrier-based and frigate-based hunter-killer groups was an effective military response. These groups could independently cover large areas and pursue the threat. Overall, anti-submarine warfare was a combination of technology, training, intelligence, and tactics. Success in this field depended on a balance between detection tools and speed of response.
In the final years of World War II, while the major powers were bowing to economic and humanitarian pressure, parts of the military were still searching for ideas that could turn the tide of the war. These efforts continued in the form of secret and top-secret projects that sometimes became reality and sometimes remained just a risky idea on paper. One of the most extensive branches in this field was the testing of unconventional weapons. These weapons were based on principles that had not been used on the battlefield before. Many of these projects remained hidden from public view for years, only to be revealed in official documents and military reports after the end of the war. Among these projects were projects that attempted to put nature to the service of war. Some of the first examples of biological weapons were formed during this period. The idea was to use living organisms as vectors of disease. Some groups experimented with infected insects to transport pathogens to enemy territory. While these methods sometimes seemed successful on paper, they were extremely risky in practice. The spread of disease was difficult to control, and there was a risk of it returning to friendly forces. For this reason, many of these projects were stopped in the experimental stage. In addition to trying to use microbial agents, another group worked on chemicals. These agents were often designed to be odorless and colorless to make them difficult to detect. Soldiers exposed to these agents without proper protection suffered severe burns, tearing, and respiratory distress. Such materials could be used on the front lines, but they were also dangerous to friendly forces, especially when the wind was blowing from behind or the weather was unpredictable. Some countries reportedly had stockpiles of these materials, but widespread use was rare due to concerns about enemy retaliation. Other military efforts of the era included projects directly related to electronic equipment. These projects sought to find a way to disrupt enemy radar and communications. Examples of small devices were designed that would deflect or cut off radar signals by sending waves at specific frequencies. There were also attempts to interfere with air navigation systems. These devices were used on a limited scale, but their mass production faced technical and industrial obstacles. Alongside these technologies, the construction of small, stealthy subs was also pursued. Some of them were designed for only 2 or 3 people and were intended to approach the enemy's shores secretly. These units would arrive at the target at night, set off explosives, and then try to retreat before being discovered. The water pressure, total darkness, and the lack of adequate equipment made the mission extremely dangerous. The forces participating in these operations had to undergo special training to be able to survive in conditions of low oxygen and low temperatures. Few of these operations were successful, but the experience gained became the basis for future subsea special forces. Some militaries also sought to develop missiles that could correct their course in the air. The technology was rudimentary at the time, but the idea of guiding them to their targets through simple sensors was born. These sensors typically used radio waves or heat. Although many examples were unreliable, advances in this area later played a key role in the development of modern guided missiles. The flow of information was vital in these projects. Many documents were kept in remote facilities, away from public view. Employees were sworn to secrecy and were not allowed to discuss their activities with anyone. Security was tight. Access to classified areas was restricted by special codes, and the slightest violation was met with severe punishment. Some of these laboratories were built deep underground to protect them from aerial bombardment. During this period, many prominent scientists, either willingly or under pressure from governments, entered military projects. Their expertise led to designs that went beyond existing technology. However, implementation problems and shortages of raw materials in the final years of the war prevented many of these designs from being completed. It was also difficult to retain skilled manpower. Dangerous experiments constantly threatened the lives of researchers. Chemical leaks, unexpected explosions, and errors in conducting experiments were common problems. Reports indicate that in some laboratories, even basic safety precautions could not be observed. Work environments were often poorly ventilated, and direct contact with toxic substances was inevitable. Many workers suffered from respiratory or skin problems, but they had no choice but to continue working. Logistically, these projects required continuous deliveries of materials and equipment. But as the bombing of supply lines intensified, it became difficult to get supplies to these centers. Sometimes, projects were halted for months simply because of a shortage of a particular material. In some cases, officials were forced to use unreliable substitutes that made the outcome unpredictable. The effort to keep these projects secret meant that some of them remained hidden from field commanders. Manufacturers and researchers sometimes did not know exactly how their products were going to be used in the field. This disconnect between theory and practice reduced the effectiveness of some designs. On the battlefield, rumors about enemy special weapons spread among the troops. Sometimes an unknown incident was enough to create a wave of concern among the troops. Reports of unusual explosions or strange symptoms among the soldiers reinforced these fears. In some cases, the enemy also tried to increase this fear by spreading false information and weakening the morale of the opposing forces. Ultimately, many of these designs never reached the stage of widespread use, but the experience gained from them was used in scientific and military research in the years after the war. Many of the technologies used today in military or civilian industries have their origins in those same secret laboratories. The special projects of World War II not only influenced the course of the war at the time, but also influenced the course of technological progress in the following decades. Many of these technologies evolved in the future and played a fundamental role in shaping modern warfare. Although many never saw the light of day on the battlefield, their legacy lives on in the tools we know today.
In the final years of the war, command decisions were made under pressure and under pressure of time. Priorities were set based on the availability of resources, the position of the front, and the ability to provide logistical support. Command setters received limited and sometimes contradictory information. Rapid adaptation of plans to changing field conditions was common. A sudden attack or a calculated retreat was adopted depending on the operational situation. Commanders had to weigh the human and material costs of each operation. In many cases, the decision to launch an operation was made on the basis of detailed information. Combat units were sent to the battle zone with a limited plan and a specific mission. Secure communications between units were vital for coordinated execution. Long distances and delays in messaging could change the outcome of the operation. Logistics management in wartime meant the difference between success and failure. Supply lines were bombed and needed protection. Fuel, ammunition, and food supplies had to be constantly replenished to keep operations going. Rail and sea transport made up a large part of the logistical effort. The destruction of enemy bridges and ports reduced their ability to move. Rapid repair of infrastructure was essential to maintain the flow of supplies. Engineer units played a key role in rebuilding roads and bridges. It was difficult to obtain spare parts for heavy equipment under siege and bombing. Distinguishing priorities between frontline needs and rear-line needs was a challenge for command. Medical care and the transport of the wounded were part of the field support mechanism. Field hospitals with limited facilities were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of casualties. Rapid transport of the wounded to specialized facilities was often crucial to their survival. Shortages of medicine and surgical equipment were a constant issue in the rear lines. Efforts to prevent the spread of infectious diseases among troops were of paramount importance. Commanders relied on intelligence data to make decisions. Intelligence networks and human resources played an important role in providing field intelligence. Decoding and analyzing messages clarified enemy movement pictures. But misinformation or deception also often led to poor decisions. Timed operations required careful coordination between ground, air, and naval forces. Simultaneous attacks from multiple axes were used to overcome local defenses. Fire control and real-time target prioritization were the responsibilities of field commanders. Engineer units played a role in clearing the field of mines and obstacles. Enemy mines significantly restricted traffic and troop mobility. Mine detection and clearance required specialized equipment and training. In urban areas, battles became street battles. Urban battles required close-quarters tactics and a careful division of labor. Buildings became temporary strongholds with every floor vulnerable. Identifying safe routes for troops to cross and resupply seemed essential. Artillery fire in urban areas increased the risk to civilian life. Managing the evacuation of civilians and sheltering them in wartime was a major responsibility. Maintaining the water and electricity infrastructure in liberated cities was vital. Controlling communication centers meant controlling local intelligence. Retaking areas from the enemy required systematic clearing of booby traps and mines. Rapid reconstruction of logistical and administrative facilities was necessary for the deployment of a sustained force. Air support was essential and dangerous for close support of ground units. Poor coordination of air support could cause friendly casualties. The air fleet played a major role in offensive operations and airborne supply. In amphibious operations, the timing of landings and coordination with supporting fleets were crucial. Weather conditions could disrupt large plans entirely. Managing fuel supplies for ships and aircraft was part of the constant planning. The supply of engine and propeller parts in war conditions was difficult and critical. Field repair units had to be able to restore damaged equipment in the shortest possible time. The storage of sensitive materials such as rocket fuel or explosives was strictly controlled. The security of these facilities was vital to prevent sabotage. Information operations could be used to distract the enemy from real objectives. Psychological warfare and the dissemination of targeted information were used to demoralize the enemy. Radio and field newspapers were the main tools of psychological warfare. Interception of enemy messages and the dissemination of false information were common tactics.
Protecting encrypted communication lines from enemy eavesdropping was a priority. Training troops in the use of communication equipment and protecting information were challenges. Supplying advancing forces required speed and flexibility. Relief routes in war zones were often under constant threat. Alternate sources and secondary routes were planned to maintain the flow of supplies. Storage in hidden bunkers and their movement in stages were protective methods. Manpower in the rear lines was sometimes overworked and sleep-deprived. Fatigue and weakness of manpower affected the quality of operations. The equitable distribution of manpower between the front and rear was a management issue. The appointment of regional commanders was often based on experience and competence. Successful commanders were able to make quick decisions in uncertain situations. Reporting systems were in place to track the status of equipment and troops. Information was sent to command centers on a real-time or near real-time basis. Prioritization of equipment repairs and maintenance was done at operational centers. Air supply lines were used in areas where the terrain was impassable. Field airports and emergency landing points were vital for support. The handling of prisoners of war and their management was a source of intelligence and a logistical challenge. Feeding and housing prisoners were essential tasks of support centers. Evacuation of mine-contaminated areas and their clearance was a prerequisite for civilian settlement. Engineering units with detailed maps and specialized equipment carried out clearance operations. Recapturing ports and relocating commercial activities were post-war priorities. Securing sea lanes was important for the return of essential goods and materials. Managing casualties and military memorabilia was part of the post-war administrative system. Collecting and recording operational documents and reports was essential for post-war analysis. Post-war analysis helped improve future tactics and training. The transfer of technologies gained from the battlefield to civilian industries began. After war, research and development units systematically reviewed data. Preserving samples and technical documents for future research was important. Dealing with war crimes and reports of human rights abuses was a sensitive legal issue. International trials and investigations shed light on some of the abuses and human experimentation. These processes led to the development of international legal frameworks in the post-war period. Environmental cleanup and the return of agricultural land to production required long-term plans. Rebuilding electricity, water, and sanitation facilities were vital for the local population. International relief programs and humanitarian organizations became active at this stage. Involving local communities in reconstruction accelerated the pace of recovery. Reviewing military structures and learning from failures and successes was a priority. Many field techniques and procedures were incorporated into the training of post-war armies. Field experience documents were used to train future generations of military commanders. Field experience demonstrated that rapid adaptation to conditions and operational flexibility were key to success. Post-war reconstruction required cooperation between the military, the government, and the international community. Ultimately, the war conditions led to the development of new methods and structures in the conduct of military operations that remained effective for decades.